Welcome, friends. Settle in, let your body sink into the mattress, and let's wander into a corner of history that no one asked for, but that somehow shaped the world anyway. We're not here for battles, treaties, or noble speeches. We're here for the stuff history teachers conveniently skip over, mostly because they want to keep their jobs. Let's start with Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King. He ruled for 72 years, wore heels higher than most drag queens, and spent his life in the dazzling palace of Versailles. Versailles is remembered as a marvel of architecture, glittering with chandeliers and gold. But beneath the sparkle was a reality that smelled less like roses and more like open sewers. Yes, the Sun King lived in a palace with hundreds of courtiers, fountains, gardens, and luxury, but no working bathrooms. And because Versailles was basically a giant marble box dropped in the middle of the countryside, there wasn't a sewage system either. Thousands of nobles, servants, and hangers-on lived there, all dressed in powdered wigs and silks. But when nature called, they handled it creatively. People relieved themselves in hallways, staircases, behind curtains, even in fireplaces. Guests wrote about how the place reeked in summer, which makes sense considering the lack of plumbing. Imagine being a duke in full velvet attire, dodging piles of waste on your way to ask the king for a favor. Nothing says absolute monarchy quite like slipping in something unpleasant on the palace stairs. And yet, this smelly oversight shaped politics. Because courtiers couldn't just hang out in their private bathrooms, since they didn't have any. Most of them stayed close to the king's chambers. It kept them dependent, cramped, and constantly in each other's business. Versailles wasn't just about gold leaf, it was about surveillance. If you wanted to survive in that stink-filled palace, you had to orbit around Louis like a fly around. Well, you get the picture. Even the king himself wasn't immune. Louis XIV had a whole ritual around using the toilet, which at the time meant sitting on a padded wooden chair with a chamber pot underneath. Nobles considered it an honor to be present while the king relieved himself because nothing says prestige like making eye contact with your monarch while he's doing his business. The Sun King, shining brightly, sitting on his throne in the least metaphorical way possible. Now, here's the boring secret. This whole bathroom fiasco indirectly influenced European diplomacy. Other monarchs copied Versailles, thinking it was the peak of sophistication. So you had German princes building smaller, equally impractical palaces, and British aristocrats covering their estates with marble while still dumping chamber pots out the window. It was luxury without sanitation, a combination that sounds absurd to us but was very on brand for the 17th and 18th centuries. So, next time someone mentions Versailles as a symbol of elegance, just remember, it also smelled like a porta potty at a summer music festival. Let's drift quietly from French bathrooms to another royal catastrophe. The Habsburg Jaw. The Habsburg dynasty was Europe's most powerful family for centuries. They married into nearly every royal line, which was their strength, and also their downfall. See, the Habsburgs believed in keeping it in the family. Not in the charming sense of loyalty, but in the disturbing sense of cousins marrying cousins for generations. This noble strategy eventually produced what's now called the Habsburg jaw. Imagine a chin so prominent it could probably open its own wine bottles. Portraits of the family reveal a progression of jawlines that went from noticeable to cartoonishly impossible. By the time Charles II of Spain rolled around in the late 1600s, the poor man could barely chew food, speak clearly, or even close his mouth properly. Charles II wasn't just struggling with his jaw. Thanks to centuries of inbreeding, he had a laundry list of health issues. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8. He suffered from seizures, digestive issues, and infertility. Essentially, the most powerful throne in Europe was occupied by a man whose genetic deck had been thoroughly reshuffled in the worst possible way. The tragic part? His personal misery had global consequences. Charles II's inability to produce an heir led to the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that involved almost every major European power. Millions were affected because royal families couldn't stop marrying their cousins. The butterfly effect, except instead of a butterfly flapping its wings, it was an overgrown chin altering the course of history. Court gossip didn't help either. Charles's subjects genuinely believed he was cursed, possibly possessed, or maybe even bewitched. He was nicknamed the Bewitched and treated as a living omen. The poor man was basically living in the Game of Thrones version of high school, where everyone whispered behind his back, while also depending on him not to die prematurely. Spoiler, he did. And Spain's entire empire unraveled afterward. So the next time someone says history is shaped by great men, you can quietly remember that sometimes it's shaped by bone structure. Let's float over to another royal disaster. Henry VIII's rotten leg. Let's gently drift across the channel from Spain to England, where King Henry VIII is waiting for us. You probably know him as the guy with 6 wives and a serious commitment issue. But behind the drama of marriages, annulments, and head chopping, Henry spent much of his later life haunted by something less famous but far smellier. His leg. Yes, the great Tudor monarch, who once strutted around as a tall, athletic figure, ended up limping painfully on an ulcerated, pus-filled sore that never healed. It all started after a jousting accident in 1536. Henry was thrown from his horse, crushed under armor, and suffered a leg wound that doctors tried to treat with the cutting-edge medicine of the day. Leeches, poultices, and whatever herbs happened to be lying around. Spoiler. None of it worked. From then on, his wound refused to close, constantly reopening and leaking. Contemporary accounts describe the smell as overwhelming. Courtiers wrote about how entire rooms reeked when Henry entered, which is not exactly the majestic aura you want as an absolute monarch. But the ulcer wasn't just unpleasant, it changed history. Because of his pain, Henry became more irritable, paranoid, and short-tempered. His fits of rage combined with his famously unhealthy diet, mountains of meat, wine, and basically zero vegetables, worsened his health and judgment. By the time he married his last wife, Catherine Parr, he was obese, diseased, and barely able to walk. Yet people still had to bow and scrape before him, pretending he was the glorious defender of the realm, while in reality he was a smelly, angry man on the verge of collapsing. It gets even darker. Henry's physical decline likely made him more ruthless politically. His paranoia about heirs and succession was heightened by his failing health, which partly explains the messy trail of discarded wives. That leg ulcer wasn't just a medical inconvenience. It was an uninvited guest at the royal table, shaping decisions that rippled across England's future. Imagine being a courtier standing 2 feet away from the king's infected leg, trying not to gag while listening to him shout about treason. History books talk about the English Reformation, but really a lot of it was powered by rotting flesh and untreated wounds. Now let's slide quietly from Henry's leg to another royal mess across Europe. Catherine the Great's PR problem. Catherine the Great of Russia is remembered as a powerful empress, expanding the empire and modernizing Russian society. But she's also remembered for something else: a rumor, and not a flattering one. After her death in 1796, whispers began spreading across Europe that Catherine had died in the middle of an intimate encounter with a horse. Yes, that rumor. It's absurd, impossible, and cruel, but it stuck. It stuck so firmly that even today, when people hear Catherine the Great's name, the horse story pops up. In reality, Catherine died of a stroke in her bed. No horses were involved. The rumor was pure political slander, spread by enemies who wanted to tarnish her reputation. And it worked better than any propaganda campaign. Instead of being remembered first as one of the most effective rulers in Russian history, she's remembered for a grotesque false story. Why did it spread so easily? Because Catherine was a woman in power. She'd already shocked conservative Europe by divorcing her useless husband, Peter III, seizing the throne, and taking lovers openly throughout her reign. Her enemies found the most humiliating, degrading rumor they could imagine, and plastered it across Europe's gossip network. The boring secret here is that slander shaped Catherine's legacy far more than her actual policies. While she reformed education, corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers, and brought European culture into Russia, her image became a caricature of lust and scandal. Centuries later, you'll still find her name attached to one of history's ugliest fake stories. So, if you ever think fake news is a modern invention, remember Catherine. A brilliant empress reduced in memory to a cruel punchline because rumors travel faster than reforms. And with that, let's drift gently toward another royal disaster. George III and the purple urine now. Let's settle into the reign of Britain's George III. He's often remembered as the Mad King who lost the American colonies. But what exactly made him mad? Turns out it might not have been madness at all. George suffered from a mysterious illness that caused violent fits, rambling speech, and bizarre behavior. At times he'd talk nonstop for hours, gesture wildly, and seem completely detached from reality. His doctors tried everything, including restraining him in straitjackets and applying blistering ointments. Very soothing. For centuries, historians just assumed he had some form of mental illness, but modern researchers have suggested another possibility: porphyria, a rare blood disorder. One symptom of porphyria is urine that turns blue or purple when exposed to air. Yes, the king's bathroom habits might have provided the biggest clue. Imagine the servants quietly noting the color change and not daring to mention it out loud. If porphyria was the cause, then George wasn't mad in the way his contemporaries believed. He was sick, and the treatments probably made things worse. The endless bleeding, purging, and restraining likely prolonged his suffering and fueled his erratic behavior. The impact? Britain was governed for long stretches by regents while George struggled, which shifted political power and set precedents for constitutional monarchy. So, America declared independence while the man on the throne was literally struggling with purple urine and medical torture. It's almost poetic. One of the most important shifts in world history, unfolding while the British monarch was misunderstood, mistreated, and mocked by his own people. And with that, let's slowly drift to yet another royal misadventure: Napoleon's shortcomings that weren't about height. Let's float softly now to France again, but this time to Napoleon Bonaparte. You've probably heard the classic myth that Napoleon was incredibly short, stomping around in a fury like an angry toy soldier. That's one of history's more persistent lies. In reality, Napoleon was about 5 feet 6 inches or 5 feet 7 inches, which was pretty average for his time. The short Napoleon idea came from a combination of British propaganda and a confusion between French and English units of measurement. So, if he wasn't unusually short, what was the actual problem? Well, Napoleon had other shortcomings. For one thing, he had terrible hemorrhoids. Painful, inflamed, and impossible to ignore, especially when you're trying to ride a horse for hours leading your army across Europe. In fact, his hemorrhoids were so severe during the Battle of Waterloo that they might have contributed to his defeat. Imagine trying to command troops, maneuver cavalry, and direct artillery while every minute in the saddle feels like sitting on a pile of hot coals. Not exactly conducive to world domination, but Napoleon's medical woes didn't stop there. He also suffered from chronic stomach pain, possibly linked to ulcers or even stomach cancer, which eventually killed him. His personal physician noted that he was constantly plagued by digestive issues, heartburn, constipation, and cramps. Basically, the man who shook Europe's political order spent a good portion of his time fighting battles with his own insides. And then there's his vanity. Napoleon was obsessed with control and image. He commissioned endless portraits of himself looking majestic, heroic, and dignified. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, he was slathering on cologne to mask his body odor. People who knew him described him as smelling strongly of sweat and musk, even under all the perfume. Not quite the immortal aura he wanted. So yes, Napoleon reshaped Europe, crowned himself emperor, and changed warfare forever. But at the same time, he was sore, smelly, and distracted by digestive drama. The so-called great man of history, squirming uncomfortably in his chair. Let's drift gently away from Napoleon's saddle sores to another royal oddity. Queen Victoria's endless mourning. Now let's glide softly into the Victorian era. Queen Victoria ruled Britain for over 6 decades, presiding over the height of the British Empire. She's remembered as a symbol of moral authority and rigid propriety. But behind that iron exterior was a personal obsession with death. Specifically with her dead husband, Prince Albert. When Albert died in 1861, Victoria basically shut down emotionally. She plunged into deep mourning that lasted for the rest of her life. And when I say mourning, I don't mean she wore black for a year or 2. I mean she wore black for 40 years. Every day, for 4 decades, her wardrobe looked like a funeral procession. Her mourning went beyond fashion. She had Albert's rooms kept exactly as he left them, with fresh clothes laid out daily as though he might return at any moment. His shaving water was delivered every morning, even though he'd been dead for decades. His portrait was everywhere, his presence constant. Victoria essentially turned her marriage into a permanent shrine. This had political consequences. Her reclusiveness made her deeply unpopular in Britain. For years, people referred to her as the Widow of Windsor, criticizing her for vanishing from public life. While the empire expanded, its monarch was too busy weeping in black lace to attend important events. Of course, there's also the hypocrisy. While she insisted on mourning Albert endlessly, Victoria didn't exactly abstain from companionship. She grew very close to her Scottish servant, John Brown, sparking rumors of a secret romance. Later, she formed an attachment to an Indian servant, Abdul Karim, causing scandals in the British court. So, while Albert was immortalized in spirit, Victoria wasn't entirely alone in practice. The boring secret here is that a single woman's private grief shaped the public image of Britain for decades. The Victorian age, with all its moral rigidity and obsession with respectability, was literally anchored in one queen's inability to move on from a personal loss. Let's drift from widow's weeds to yet another royal predicament. Ludwig II and his fairy tale escapism. Now let's wander into Bavaria, where King Ludwig II ruled in the 19th century. You might not recognize his name immediately, but you probably know his castles. Neuschwanstein, with its turrets and towers, looks like something straight out of a Disney movie, because it literally inspired the design of Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle. Ludwig was nicknamed the Fairy Tale King, and not in a flattering way. While other monarchs worried about parliaments and wars, Ludwig spent his time and money building fantasy palaces that looked like stage sets. He was obsessed with opera, especially the works of Richard Wagner. He even built a private theater where he could watch Wagner's productions alone, because having an audience would ruin the mood. The problem was, all of this cost money. A lot of money. Ludwig drained Bavaria's finances on his building projects, creating glittering castles that served no real purpose except to indulge his fantasies. Ministers were horrified, taxpayers were furious, and Ludwig became increasingly isolated. As his debts piled up, so did suspicions about his mental health. People whispered that he was insane, unfit to rule, too lost in his fairy tale world to handle reality. Eventually, he was declared mentally ill and deposed. 2 days later, he was found dead in a lake under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, the story has never quite added up. The boring secret is that Ludwig's escapism left behind an architectural legacy that defines Bavaria to this day. His financial disasters turned into tourist gold. Millions now visit Neuschwanstein each year, bringing in far more revenue than Ludwig ever dreamed of. His downfall became Bavaria's long-term profit. So while other kings are remembered for wars and treaties, Ludwig is remembered for castles that look great on Instagram. History has a strange sense of humor. Let's float quietly now toward another royal disaster. Marie Antoinette's hair. Problems. Let's drift back to France one last time, to Marie Antoinette, the queen best remembered for supposedly saying, "Let them eat cake." She never actually said that, of course, but it's the kind of quote that sticks because it makes her sound like an out-of-touch influencer before Instagram existed. But the truth is, Marie Antoinette's real obsession wasn't cake. It was hair. Specifically, giant, towering hairstyles that reached impossible heights. These weren't just wigs, they were architectural projects. Some were 2 feet tall, stuffed with padding, powder, and even props. She once had a ship modeled into her hairstyle to celebrate a naval victory. Yes, an actual ship, sails and all, sitting on her head. Now, as you might imagine, these hair sculptures weren't comfortable. They took hours to construct and were impossible to wash. Instead, they were slathered with animal fat to hold everything together, which of course attracted lice and bugs. Noble women scratched their scalps with long sticks like fancy back scratchers for the head. It wasn't glamorous, it was itchy, smelly, and occasionally alive. Marie's wigs also became a symbol of extravagance. At a time when peasants struggled to afford bread, the queen's mile-high hairstyles looked like insults on legs. Pamphleteers mocked her mercilessly, drawing cartoons of her hair growing so tall it touched the ceiling. Her beauty routine became political ammunition. The irony? These elaborate wigs helped fuel the French Revolution. While she was busy stacking hair pieces, her people were busy sharpening guillotines. History teachers talk about economics and Enlightenment ideals, but sometimes revolutions are accelerated by a bad fashion choice. So when you see a costume drama with Marie Antoinette in giant wigs, remember, they weren't just ridiculous. They were a part of what toppled a monarchy. Let's glide away from powdered hair toward another royal catastrophe. Ivan the Terrible's family, issues next stop, Russia again. This time with Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. The name isn't misleading. Ivan was one of history's greatest overreactors. He ruled in the 1500s, creating Russia's centralized state, but his reign is remembered for cruelty, paranoia, and outbursts that would put modern reality TV stars to shame. Ivan had a temper problem, and not in the cute, oops, I'm moody way. His rages were legendary. The most infamous incident came in 1581, when he struck his own son and heir in the head with a staff during an argument. The blow killed the young man, leaving Russia without a competent successor. Ivan wept afterward, horrified by what he'd done. But the damage was permanent. Russia slid into a period of instability known as the Time of Troubles, all because one man couldn't keep his temper in check. Beyond family tragedy, Ivan's paranoia led to bizarre policies. He created the Oprichnina, a private terror force that dressed in black, rode black horses, and carried dog heads and brooms on their saddles, symbols of sniffing out treason and sweeping it away. What they actually did was slaughter towns, confiscate lands, and terrorize the population. It was theater, cruelty, and state building rolled into one messy package. But Ivan also had softer eccentricities. He was deeply religious, constantly swinging between brutal violence and pious devotion. He'd massacre thousands, then spend days repenting in prayer. He was like a pendulum, except the swings involved bloodshed and incense. The boring secret here? Russia's later instability, invasions, and dynastic crises can all be traced back to Ivan losing his temper one day and hitting his son too hard. World history, altered by a domestic argument gone wrong. Let's slide gently from Russia's rage issues to another royal disaster. King Charles II of England's pet collection time to float back to England, where King Charles II reigned after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Charles is remembered for reopening theaters, embracing the arts, and fathering at least a dozen illegitimate children. But he also had a strange passion: collecting pets. The royal palace at Whitehall became a literal zoo under Charles. He kept exotic animals sent as diplomatic gifts: elephants, camels, and even a pelican. But his true obsession was dogs, particularly spaniels. The breed we now call Cavalier King Charles Spaniels is named after him because he loved them so much. He let the dogs run free in the palace, even during important meetings. Ambassadors reported that negotiations were interrupted by barking, scratching, and the occasional accident on the royal carpets. Imagine trying to discuss trade while a spaniel chewed your shoe. Charles also enjoyed keeping monkeys, parrots, and other animals that weren't exactly palace-trained. The result was a court that smelled less like royal grandeur and more like a barnyard. Yet courtiers had to pretend this was charming. After all, if the king wanted his lapdog to sit in on council meetings, who was going to say no? The boring secret is that Charles's obsession with pets had political undertones. His informality and playfulness helped restore some warmth to the monarchy after years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell. People liked the image of a fun-loving, dog-obsessed king compared to dour religious fanatics. In other words, puppies helped rehabilitate the monarchy. It's almost poetic. One of England's most scandalous kings rebuilt royal popularity with the help of wagging tails. Let's drift gently now from barking dogs to another royal oddity: Caligula's horse obsession. Let's drift all the way back to ancient Rome for a moment, specifically to the Emperor Caligula. He ruled in the 1st century AD and is mostly remembered as one of Rome's most unhinged leaders. Even by Roman standards, which already included a lot of questionable behavior, Caligula stood out. One of his strangest habits involved his horse, Incitatus. Caligula loved this horse more than most people love their spouses. According to ancient writers, Incitatus had a marble stable, an ivory manger, and purple blankets, the ancient Roman equivalent of luxury bedding. He was fed oats mixed with gold flakes, which sounds less like animal care and more like a digestion hazard. Caligula supposedly wanted to make Incitatus a consul, one of Rome's highest political offices. Historians still argue about whether this was a serious plan or just Caligula's way of mocking the Senate. Either way, the symbolism was clear. Caligula valued his horse more than Rome's politicians, which, considering Roman politics, might not have been completely irrational. The boring secret here is that the horse story wasn't just about eccentricity, it was propaganda. Roman historians hated Caligula, so they exaggerated his behavior to make him look insane. Maybe Incitatus wasn't really fed gold oats every morning. Maybe the consul plan was more of a joke. But the image stuck. A ruler so out of touch that he wanted to replace senators with livestock. And it worked. For 2,000 years, Caligula has been remembered as a lunatic. His actual political decisions matter less than the fact that he supposedly loved a horse too much. Sometimes history is shaped not by what rulers do, but by what gossip about them survives. Let's glide now from Rome's horse politics to another royal misadventure. Ferdinand I of Austria and his cravings. Moving forward to the 19th century, let's pause in Austria with Emperor Ferdinand I. He ruled during a turbulent time, but wasn't exactly well suited to the job. Ferdinand suffered from severe epilepsy and developmental disabilities, the result of, you guessed it, too much Habsburg inbreeding. He wasn't capable of serious governance, so most of the ruling was done by advisors and regents. But Ferdinand did have some quirks that stuck in the historical record. One of his most famous lines came during a bread shortage in Vienna. Angry crowds demanded cheaper rolls, and Ferdinand, confused by the situation, reportedly exclaimed, "But then they should just eat dumplings." It wasn't sarcasm. He genuinely didn't understand why people couldn't substitute one carb for another. In his mind, if bread was expensive, dumplings were the obvious solution. The line became infamous, a kind of Austrian version of "let them eat cake." Ferdinand also had an obsession with pickles. He'd shout, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings," or "I want pickles," whenever the mood struck him. Which is funny if you imagine it happening once, but probably exhausting if you were the cook in charge of palace meals. The boring secret here is that Ferdinand's incapacity as emperor led to the revolutions of 1848. He couldn't handle the uprising, so he abdicated, passing the throne to his nephew Franz Joseph. So, a man obsessed with dumplings and pickles accidentally set the stage for one of Austria's longest reigning monarchs. Snacks may not change the world often, but in this case they kind of did. Let's move gently now from dumplings to another royal disaster. King Farouk's kleptomania. Let's float toward Egypt in the 20th century. King Farouk, who ruled from 1936 until he was overthrown in 1952, was a monarch with a sticky-fingered problem. He was a kleptomaniac. Despite being absurdly wealthy, he had the habit of stealing things. Farouk would swipe items from hotels, shops, even from people he met. He famously stole a pocket watch from Winston Churchill. On another occasion, he allegedly walked off with a valuable sword from a military museum. The man had palaces full of treasure, but apparently nothing was as satisfying as petty theft. He also had an enormous appetite, literally. Farouk was known to eat entire multi-course meals late at night, consuming quantities of food that shocked his staff. His weight ballooned, and by the time of his abdication, he was often mocked as the stomach with a head. Subtle, Farouk's behavior made him deeply unpopular. While his people struggled under economic hardship, their king was busy hoarding cars, jewels, and random objects he didn't even need. His kleptomania and excess became symbols of corruption. Eventually, the Egyptian army had enough. He was overthrown and sent into exile where he died young, collapsed at dinner after yet another massive meal. The boring secret is that Farouk's petty habits helped destroy Egypt's monarchy. People might have tolerated royal luxury, but royal theft and gluttony? That was a step too far. His downfall shows how personal quirks can snowball into political revolutions. And with that, let's drift softly to another royal eccentric. King Ludwig XIV's toothless smile. Let's drift gently back to France again, but this time to the end of the 17th century. We've already talked about Louis XIV's bathroom issues, but his teeth deserve their own section. Dentistry in the 1600s was basically medieval torture with a fancy wig, and Louis XIV got the full experience. By his 30s, he had constant toothaches. Eventually, his dentist decided to just yank them all out. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, just forceps, prayers, and screaming. In one particularly unlucky session, several teeth were pulled at once, and part of his upper jawbone came out with them. This tore a hole into his sinus cavity, leaving him with a permanent opening between his mouth and nose. That meant whenever he drank, liquid would sometimes come out of his nose. Not exactly the majestic image of the Sun King. The consequences were more than just personal embarrassment. Without teeth, Louis couldn't chew properly, so he switched to softer foods, leading to constant indigestion. He also suffered terrible bad breath, described by courtiers as overwhelming. Imagine having to bow low in front of the king, only to be knocked out by waves of halitosis. But here's the boring secret. Louis's dental misery actually influenced French cuisine. Because the king needed soft food, court chefs began focusing more on sauces, creams, and finely prepared dishes instead of tough roasts. The haute cuisine we now associate with French cooking partly developed because the king had no teeth. So, the next time you enjoy a delicate French sauce, remember, it might exist because of one monarch's gaping dental hole. Let's slide gently now from teeth to another royal disaster. Peter the Great's beard. Obsession over in Russia, Peter the Great had his own strange fixation. Beards. When he became Tsar at the end of the 17th century, he decided Russia needed to modernize and look more European. To him, that meant no more long, bushy beards. So he introduced the beard tax. If you wanted to keep your facial hair, you had to pay for it. And not just once, every year. After paying, you'd receive a little copper token that said, "The beard is a superfluous burden." Nothing like being shamed by your own pocket change. Peter didn't stop there. He personally went around with scissors cutting off the beards of nobles who resisted. Imagine being one of the most powerful men in Russia and suddenly having the Tsar himself lunging at your face with shears. Very dignified. Of course, this wasn't just about grooming, it was about control. By forcing nobles to shave or pay, Peter was pushing Russia away from traditional customs and toward westernization. But it also created deep resentment. To many Russians, the beard was a sacred symbol of masculinity and faith. Shaving it off felt like an attack on their identity. So the boring secret here is that Russia's modernization was partly enforced through facial hair. Political authority expressed in sideburns and stubble, Centuries of cultural struggle, all because one czar hated beards. Let's float from beards now to another royal oddity. The Pope who dug up a dead pope. This one takes us to the papacy, where things got truly weird. In 897, Pope Stephen VI decided he really hated his predecessor, Pope Formosus. But there was a problem. Formosus was already dead. Most people would let that go. Stephen did not. Instead, he ordered Formosus's corpse dug up, dressed in papal robes, and put on trial. Yes, an actual trial. The body was propped up on a throne while a deacon stood beside it to answer questions on behalf of the deceased. The charges? Perjury, breaking church law, and basically being a bad pope. Unsurprisingly, the corpse was found guilty. Stephen then had the body stripped of its robes, 3 fingers cut off, and finally thrown into the Tiber River. This bizarre event is known as the Cadaver Synod, and it plunged the papacy into chaos. People were horrified, not necessarily because of the injustice, but because of the sheer grotesque spectacle. Within months, Stephen himself was overthrown, imprisoned, and strangled to death. The boring secret here is that this circus of a trial weakened papal authority for years. Rival factions used it as an excuse to question the legitimacy of various popes. So, European politics already messy got even messier, all because one man decided to yell at a corpse in public. Let's float away now from corpses on thrones to another royal misadventure. Charles VI of France and the Glass Delusion. Now we drift back to medieval France, where King Charles VI ruled in the late 14th century. He was nicknamed Charles the Mad, which gives you a clue about how things went. Charles suffered from recurring bouts of psychosis. Sometimes he forgot his own name. Other times he insisted he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He believed his body could shatter at any moment. He refused to let people touch him, wore reinforced clothing, and sometimes sat perfectly still for hours, afraid to move. Courtiers were ordered to approach him carefully as though he might break. This strange condition was part of a broader phenomenon historians now call the Glass Delusion. For reasons no one fully understands, several people in medieval Europe, including scholars and nobles, developed the same fear. But Charles was the most famous sufferer, which made the entire French monarchy look fragile. Literally. Politically, his instability was catastrophic. France was already in the middle of the 100 Years' War with England, and Charles's mental collapse meant rival factions started fighting for power. The civil wars between Armagnacs and Burgundians erupted while Charles wandered around terrified of being cracked like a vase. His personal delusion shaped the battlefield realities of Europe. So the boring secret is that France's medieval chaos wasn't just about knights and castles. It was also about a king hiding from hugs because he thought he was fragile glass. Let's drift softly now from glass bones to another royal mess. Emperor Elagabalus and the Banquet of Roses. Next, let's head back to Rome for another emperor with questionable priorities. Elagabalus. He ruled in the early 3rd century and was only a teenager when he became emperor. Imagine giving supreme power to a hormonal high schooler. It went about as well as you'd expect. Elagabalus is remembered for bizarre religious rituals, cross-dressing, and marrying multiple times, including to a Vestal virgin, which was a major scandal. But his strangest moment might have been a dinner party stunt. According to ancient writers, he once covered guests with rose petals from the ceiling. That sounds charming, until you realize there were so many petals that some guests reportedly suffocated. Whether or not that part is true, Elagabalus certainly turned the Roman court into a circus of indulgence. He dined on flamingo tongues, had chariots pulled by camels, and staged elaborate performances instead of governing. The Senate was horrified, the people were confused, and eventually the Praetorian Guard murdered him at just 18. His body was dragged through the streets and tossed in the Tiber River. The boring secret is that his antics discredited the Severan dynasty and deepened Rome's instability. The empire's slow decline wasn't just about military defeats. It was also about teenagers with absolute power throwing deadly dinner parties. Let's float onward from roses and rivers to another royal disaster. Joanna of Castile and the Locked Coffin. Now we drift into Spain, where Joanna of Castile lived in the early 1500s. She's better remembered by her nickname, Joanna the Mad. Like many nicknames in history, it's not entirely fair, but her life was undeniably tragic. Joanna married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. Unfortunately, handsome was about his only good quality. He was unfaithful, manipulative, and dismissive of her. Joanna became increasingly unstable, racked with jealousy and grief. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, she unraveled completely. According to accounts, Joanna refused to let go of his corpse. She had his coffin locked and traveled with it across Castile, opening it occasionally to gaze at his decaying body. People whispered that she kissed the corpse, slept beside it, and refused to bury him properly. Whether exaggerated or not, her obsession with Philip's body became legendary. She was eventually declared insane and locked away in a convent for the last 46 years of her life. The boring secret is that her supposed madness gave other rulers, her father Ferdinand, and later her son Charles V, an excuse to seize power. Joanna became a political prisoner, reduced to a symbol of instability. Spain's empire rose while its rightful queen sat isolated, clinging to memories of a dead man. Sometimes history's turning points don't look like battles. Sometimes they look like a lonely widow sitting beside a coffin. Let's drift softly now toward another royal eccentricity. Charles VI of France and the Glass Delusion. Now we drift back to medieval France, where King Charles VI ruled in the late 14th century. He was nicknamed Charles the Mad, which gives you a clue about how things went. Charles suffered from recurring bouts of psychosis. Sometimes he forgot his own name. Other times he insisted he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He believed his body could shatter at any moment. He refused to let people touch him, wore reinforced clothing, and sometimes sat perfectly still for hours, afraid to move. Courtiers were ordered to approach him carefully, as though he might break. This strange condition was part of a broader phenomenon historians now call the Glass Delusion. For reasons no one fully understands, several people in medieval Europe, including scholars and nobles, developed the same fear. But Charles was the most famous sufferer, which made the entire French monarchy look fragile. Literally. Politically, his instability was catastrophic. France was already in the middle of the 100 Years' War with England, and Charles's mental collapse meant rival factions started fighting for power. The civil wars between Armagnacs and Burgundians erupted while Charles wandered around, terrified of being cracked like a vase. His personal delusion shaped the battlefield realities of Europe. So the boring secret is that France's medieval chaos wasn't just about knights and castles. It was also about a king hiding from hugs because he thought he was fragile glass. Emperor Elagabalus and the Banquet of Roses next. Let's head back to Rome for another emperor with questionable priorities. Elagabalus. He ruled in the early 3rd century and was only a teenager when he became emperor. Imagine giving supreme power to a hormonal high schooler. It went about as well as you'd expect. Elagabalus is remembered for bizarre religious rituals, cross-dressing, and marrying multiple times, including to a Vestal virgin, which was a major scandal. But his strangest moment might have been a dinner party stunt. According to ancient writers, he once covered guests with rose petals from the ceiling. That sounds charming, until you realize there were so many petals that some guests reportedly suffocated. Whether or not that part is true, Elagabalus certainly turned the Roman court into a circus of indulgence. He dined on flamingo tongues, had chariots pulled by camels, and staged elaborate performances instead of governing. The Senate was horrified, the people were confused, and eventually the Praetorian Guard murdered him at just 18. His body was dragged through the streets and tossed in the Tiber River. The boring secret is that his antics discredited the Severan dynasty and deepened Rome's instability. The empire's slow decline wasn't just about military defeats. It was also about teenagers with absolute power throwing deadly dinner parties. Joanna of Castile and the locked coffin. Now we drift into Spain, where Joanna of Castile lived in the early 1500s. She's better remembered by her nickname, Joanna the Mad. Like many nicknames in history, it's not entirely fair, but her life was undeniably tragic. Joanna married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. Unfortunately, handsome was about his only good quality. He was unfaithful, manipulative, and dismissive of her. Joanna became increasingly unstable, racked with jealousy and grief. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, she unraveled completely. According to accounts, Joanna refused to let go of his corpse. She had his coffin locked and traveled with it across Castile, opening it occasionally to gaze at his decaying body. People whispered that she kissed the corpse, slept beside it, and refused to bury him properly. Whether exaggerated or not, her obsession with Philip's body became legendary. She was eventually declared insane and locked away in a convent for the last 46 years of her life. The boring secret is that her supposed madness gave other rulers, her father Ferdinand, and later her son Charles V, an excuse to seize power. Joanna became a political prisoner, reduced to a symbol of instability. Spain's empire rose while its rightful queen sat isolated, clinging to memories of a dead man. Sometimes history's turning points don't look like battles. Sometimes they look like a lonely widow sitting beside a coffin. Ivan the Terrible and his exploding temper. Sliding gently into Russia again, let's talk about Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. He ruled in the 16th century, and his name wasn't just a catchy nickname. He truly lived up to it. Ivan had a volcanic temper that flared unpredictably. He could be generous one moment and violent the next. In one of the most infamous episodes during an argument with his son, Ivan struck him with his staff in a rage. The blow killed the young man instantly. The heir to Russia's throne died not from a grand assassination or battlefield wound, but from his father losing his temper. The tragedy meant Russia was left with a weaker successor, Ivan's mentally unstable son, Fyodor. That instability helped drag Russia into the time of troubles, a period of famine, invasions, and political chaos. One violent outburst in a palace corridor ended up shaping Russian history for decades. So the boring secret here is that the future of an empire wasn't destroyed by armies or plagues. It was destroyed by bad anger management. Queen Victoria's endless mourning. Now let's float gently to Britain in the 19th century. Queen Victoria ruled for over 60 years, but much of that reign was overshadowed by grief. When her beloved husband Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria was devastated. Instead of gradually moving on, she sank into mourning and never really came out. She dressed in black for the rest of her life, 40 years of widow's clothes. She avoided public events, retreated from London, and became known as the Widow of Windsor. Her isolation frustrated politicians and even sparked Republican movements, since many people felt the monarchy had simply disappeared from public life. But here's the quiet historical twist. Her mourning also shaped the culture of the time. Mourning jewelry, black fashion, and rituals of grief became widespread in Victorian society. Entire industries profited from death because the Queen herself turned sorrow into a lifestyle. So when we picture the Victorian era, with its stiff black dresses and obsession with mortality, we're really seeing the ripple effect of one woman's refusal to let go of her husband. King George III and the madness of monarchy. Staying in Britain, let's talk about George III, the king most Americans know as the villain of the Revolutionary War. But his later life became infamous for another reason: madness. George suffered from recurring mental illness, possibly a form of porphyria. During his attacks, he rambled endlessly, foamed at the mouth, and talked to trees. Servants reported that he would walk for hours in the gardens, carrying on conversations with nobody. At one point, he supposedly shook hands with an oak tree, convinced it was the King of Prussia. These episodes weren't just embarrassing, they created constitutional crises. Parliament had to invent new ways of governing while the king was incapacitated. The Regent Act of 1811 gave power to his son, the future George IV, starting the tradition of regency in Britain. So the boring secret is that modern British constitutional monarchy, the idea that a king can reign while others actually govern, was solidified not by clever reform, but because George III spent too much time yelling at shrubbery. Marie Antoinette and the pastry problem. Back in France, let's pause with Marie Antoinette, one of history's most misunderstood queens. She's often blamed for saying, "Let them eat cake," when told the people were starving. The funny part is, she never said it. The phrase actually appeared in a book written before she was even queen. Still, the myth stuck because it fit her reputation for extravagance. She built a private retreat at Versailles where she pretended to be a simple shepherdess. Except her sheep wore ribbons, and her farmhouse had marble floors. She hosted masked balls, imported expensive clothes, and spent on luxuries while the French economy collapsed. The truth is more nuanced. Her spending was exaggerated, and France's debt problems mostly came from wars. But perception mattered. The image of a frivolous queen who cared more about pastries than starving peasants helped ignite the French Revolution. The boring secret here is that revolutions don't always need reality. Sometimes gossip and bad PR can topple a monarchy just as effectively as guillotines. A sleepy ending. And so we've wandered through centuries of royals and rulers, through teeth pulled without anesthetic, through coffins carried across kingdoms, through emperors lost in flower petals and kings who thought they were made of glass. The pattern is always the same. History doesn't just turn on grand battles and brilliant strategies. Sometimes it changes because of bad dentistry, unchecked grief, foolish banquets, or one badly timed temper tantrum. Strange little human flaws ripple outward until they reshape entire empires. That's the real secret. World history is often built on the absurd, the tragic, and the deeply personal. So as you close your eyes now, drifting into sleep, let these odd stories fade softly in your mind. The kings and queens are long gone, their mistakes buried under centuries, their strange fears and habits nothing more than whispers in the dark. And with that, we end our quiet journey through history's boring secrets that change the world. Sleep well. Don't forget like and subscribe my channel.